What's up everybody, Jason from Jason's Exotic Reptiles. Today we're going to cover the topic of quarantining your animals. So if you're going to keep reptiles and you're going to keep multiple animals, generally you're going to need to do a quarantine. At least it's best practice to do this. So I'm going to run through today the things that I do to quarantine my animals and everything that I go through before it reaches my, what I'll call my general population, everything else that I have in my collection. Now, quarantine is super important, and a lot of people skip this step. They're too excited or they don't have the space. I think this is probably the most important step if you're going to have a large collection of reptiles, because one thing from this animal can easily transfer through many other animals that I have. So this girl right here, this is a Boa Woman Caramel that I just picked up at the New Hampshire Reptile Expo or New England Reptile Expo. And the first thing I do is I put this snake in some water. So these are going to be my quarantine steps. They're not the steps for everybody, but this is what I do and what I would recommend other people do, even if you're getting snakes from me, because things happen and I try at the best capability to provide you guys healthy animals, but occasionally things happen. I personally haven't had an experience where someone's received one of my animals and it's been in bad shape or had a disease or parasites or anything like that, so I've been fortunate, but I still recommend and encourage everybody do it with any animal. It's more of just getting into the habit of it. So if you guys saw in my video, the first thing I do is put these animals in water. So this is a pretty big girl, and what I'll do is I'll get a Tupperware container or one of those Sterilite bins and I'll fill it with water that's about half the depth of the snake. This way she always has the ability to get out of water, and you can use this method for pretty much any type of reptile unless it's a really specific thing. I'm not sure if I would do this with a leopard gecko, but bearded dragons, things like that, obviously adjusting your water depth accordingly. The biggest piece that you're going to need to cover is having these animals in water that's just sufficiently covered over the bottom, and this is going to be for mites specifically. So this isn't going to be for any diseases. This is mainly just for mites, because step one in a solid quarantine is you don't want things that can travel. So if this snake is sick, has mites, those mites travel to something else, there's a potential to get that something else sick, or potentially everything in your collection. So mites are my #1 go-to for quarantine. Step #1 is I soak these animals. Now, I made a video on this earlier, but I'll just cover this briefly. One of my first videos, I think it was aggressive mite treatment or my quarantine steps, something along those lines. I'll try to link it in the description down below so you can go right to it and check that one out. But step 1 of my quarantine is treating for mites, putting them in this water. I keep them in the water for a couple hours with just plain tap water. After that, I'll put some Dawn dish soap, the unscented, the original blue stuff. I'll put just enough in there, maybe, if I were to guess, a tablespoon. But that's going to be dependent on the amount of water. Just enough so that if I swish my hand around it, it makes some suds. And then I'll push the water all over the snake. I'm going to let this snake sit in this water overnight. And then in the morning, I'll dump the water out, I'll replace it with new water, and then I'll put some more Dawn dish soap. I'll repeat this every day for about 5 days to a week, depending on what happens. Ideally, what I like to have happen is I want to see the snake shed in the water, but that's obviously a timing thing, and we can't always have that step. So if they do shed, I might cut this to like a 4 to 5 day. If they don't shed, I might keep them there for 7 days. Specifically, if I don't know who this came from, I might just do an aggressive treatment regardless. Now, once that's done, and again, go back to my previous video, which I'll link in the description to see the full layout of that, and I do plan to remake that video to bring it further up to the top, but once that's done, I put them in a quarantine enclosure. These enclosures are completely separate from everything you see in this room. They're in their own room, their own rack. It's very sterile in there. Newspaper's the substrate. There's a water bowl that's very clean. I clean that daily. That way I can be in the cage checking out what's happening. And then I'll use some crumpled newspaper or layered newspaper as a hide. I want to make sure that everything I put in the enclosure is clean and sterile. Now at this point, this is when I go to what I'll call my observation phase. I'm going to be watching these snakes daily. I'm going to be in their enclosures, picking them up, inspecting them. This is where I'm going to see mites either on the snake or not. Hopefully not. We never want to see mites when we pick up some new animals, especially from good breeders. And then from there, I'm going to just watch them. I want to see how they're going to the bathroom. I want to see if they're eating. I'm going to listen for wheezes and pops. This snake specifically, I don't know if you'll probably see it over the course of the video, but it has a little respiratory infection. And I did notice that as soon as I put it in the water, I got this long hiss. So the snake has a little respiratory infection, and right now is on a treatment of Tylen. I'm using Tylen 200, and I'm using the appropriate dosage. I don't want to get into the medicating methods because this isn't something that I feel I want to put this advice out there. These are things that I've learned along the way, and if you feel confident giving your snake medicine and shots, then that's a good thing to do. But obviously you need to do your research, and that's not something that I want to just throw out a dosage and a medicine to use, because every respiratory infection, everything like that, is a different type of bacteria that may not be treated with Tylen. I have a bunch of different antibiotics at my disposal due to a relationship with the vet, so that's something that I have access to. And again, I don't want to get into my specific medical treatments because I'm not qualified to tell you how to do that. So this snake is on that antibiotic treatment, and again, that is something that I've noticed almost immediately when I got her home, and then I've noticed it accumulating as not necessarily getting worse, but not getting better as she was in quarantine. So that's something I will continue to treat with Tylen, and I may even do some additional testing on this snake just to make sure she's 100% healthy before she goes into what I'll call, again, my general population or my general collection, because I do not want this snake transferring diseases to other snakes I have, especially with her being the size she is. She's going to be in a larger cage. She's going to be in a breeder cage. She's going to be next to my breeder females. The last thing I want are to get other snakes, specifically older breeders that I've dumped years of time into raising and caring for, and I've grown an attachment to bring this snake in after a month or two, and all of a sudden I have 3 or 4 additional sick snakes. That's never the goal, and that's never the goal for anybody, but I really want to avoid that at all costs. So we do our initial mite treatment, we do our quarantine phase, we're observing them. Typically, I keep them in there for about a month. I don't think after a month, if you haven't seen something after a month, then you're probably not going to see it. I could keep them in there for 6 months, and I'm still not going to see it if it's a long-term disease, or there's a chance I won't see it. And again, being in the quarantine enclosures, they're semi-stressful. I consider them like the sterile enclosure that you don't necessarily want to be in, but at the same time, they need to be in there so I can not transfer disease to other snakes, and I can get these guys healthy. And with that sterile enclosure, using things like newspaper or butcher block, it allows me to observe everything on them. I can see if there's boogers on the side of the cage, I can see if their poop is looking good, or if there's something weird going on with the snake, and it also allows me just to kind of check for additional mites and other things like that. An important feature of your quarantine room or your quarantine cage, one, you want it to be away from everything else in your house or in your collection. So if you keep these things in your bedroom, you may want to see if there's another bedroom available. We obviously don't always have that opportunity, so you might have to get creative. You may have to put, I've done things like in the past where I've put duct tape rolled up around the actual enclosure. That way, if any mites do come out, they'll get stuck on the duct tape. I do treat for mites, even though they're in quarantine and they've already gone through that initial soak. I'll spray them down with some Reptile spray. Again, being mites is going to be my #1 concern because it's such an easy pathway for diseases and bloodborne diseases to be transferred. Whether we know about it or not, it's not something that I want to take a risk and a chance doing. So with that said, the next piece that we're going to go into is going to be once you figure out this snake is healthy and it is good and you've treated things like the respiratory infections, then it will go into the general population, which you can set it up in the irregular enclosure style. You can make their enclosures as fancy as you want or as minimal as you want, but the goal being that you get rid of any potential harm that you can cause to the rest of your collection while they're in that quarantine phase. Now, again, this girl, I mentioned she has a small respiratory infection. I'll likely keep her in that enclosure, in the quarantine cage, for about a month until I don't hear any wheezing, popping, hissing, any signs of a respiratory infection. This way, she is going to continue to be in that sterile enclosure. She's going to continue to be able to be treated and observed throughout this process, and I'm 100% confident before I put her in with everything else that it's going to be a healthy snake. It's not going to transfer anything. Now, the reason why I don't do like a 3-month or a 6-month long quarantine is because the quarantine itself can be stressful. that minimalistic enclosure is not necessarily an ideal enclosure for these animals. The humidity might be a little bit off, you know, they're not necessarily comfortable. So I want to try to get them out of that situation as quickly as possible. However, with a snake like this, again, I have to keep her in there because I don't want her going into the general collection or the general population of my animals until I am 100% confident she's not going to transfer that disease or that respiratory infection or whatever else it might be. So again, I've been treating her. I treat her with one set of antibiotics, the Tylen. It's getting a little bit better, but not significantly. I may switch to a Baytril at that point, or I may take her in for additional testing just to make sure. So again, with that month-long quarantine, assuming you don't see anything, if you do see something a month later, it's either a serious disease that they've had already and they were just hiding the symptoms, or it's because the quarantine enclosure is stressing them out and bringing things out, or it is because the quarantine enclosure itself is not set up properly and that's going to cause a disease. So that's really important that even though these are quarantine is just sterile. It doesn't mean we can lack on the humidity or we can lack on feeding and other items like that. We just really need to be cognizant that these animals, they are in the quarantine cage, but the goal is to get them in and out as quick as possible because, again, you're not going to see long-term diseases in quarantine. Another key piece of quarantine before I cut the video I want to recommend or remind everybody is that quarantine is truly quarantine. If I buy this snake, put it in my quarantine cage, and buy another one a week later, I can't put that snake in with this one or in the same rack or in the same kind of room because that just reset my quarantine period. There's a good chance that, not a good chance, but there's a chance that if I take this snake, I have it in there for a month, she's almost ready to go out, I buy another snake, I put that in the same quarantine room, mites can transfer or diseases can transfer from that snake to this snake, and I didn't even know it. Now this snake goes in the general population, I say, yep, my month's up, goes into the whole collection, and now things are getting sick again. So quarantine really does need to be this snake in its own enclosure, in its own room, separate from everything else before you proceed with getting more snakes. Now you can do multiple snakes at the same time in quarantine, so if I picked up 10 snakes, I can put all 10 in quarantine and observe them together. Obviously I want to keep them as separate as possible because if I do start seeing things, I want to be able to pinpoint it to exactly which snake, which animal had that original disease or that original parasite, but at the same time, being that larger group quarantine, that the time starts when everything goes in there. So again, I put a snake in my quarantine room today, clock for 30 days starts again for this snake because it's now been exposed. So hopefully this video helps a few of you guys out there. If you have additional questions, shoot me a message on Instagram, Facebook, or email, or leave me a comment down below and let's discuss this. So hopefully this video was helpful. I appreciate you guys watching, following, liking, and subscribing, and let's keep these videos coming. Thanks, guys.